George Stinney Jr. was the youngest person ever to be executed in the United States by electric chair. He was a 14-year-old African American who was forced into a confession by starvation by local police. He was then given a 2-hour trial and quickly sent to death row. His conviction was overturned 70 years later. He lived in a mill town in Alcolu in South Carolina, where whites and blacks were separated by railroad tracks. Stinney's family lived in company housing until they were forced to move after his father, George Sr., was fired from a local lumber mill where his son was accused of bludgeoning 2 white girls to death. According to court documents, on the 24th of March 1944, Betty June Binnicker, aged 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, were riding their bicycles in the black part of Alcolu looking for flowers. When they saw Stinney and his younger sister Amy outside on their property, they stopped and asked if they knew where to find any maypops, a local term for passion flowers. That was the last time the girls were seen alive. Binnicker and Thames, who were white, never made it home that day. Their disappearance prompted hundreds of Alcolu residents, including Stinney's father, to come together and search for the missing girls. It wasn't until the next morning when their bodies were discovered in a water-filled ditch with their skulls smashed in. At 2:30 p.m. that day, medical examiner A.C. Bozard performed an autopsy on both girls and determined their cause of death to be blunt force trauma. Bozard concluded that Binnicker and Thames had been struck multiple times in the head with an object with a small round head about the size of a hammer. When Clarendon County law enforcement officers learned from a witness that Binnicker and Thames were last seen talking to Stinney, they went to his home. There, George Stinney Jr. was handcuffed and taken to Sumter County Jail. There he was interrogated for hours in a locked room with no witnesses or an attorney. According to police accounts, Stinney confessed to murdering Binnicker and Thames after his plan to have sex with one of the girls failed. A month after the murders, George Stinney Jr.'s trial began at the Clarendon County courtroom, where a white court-appointed defense attorney, Charles Plowden, did little to defend his client. During the 2-hour trial, Plowden failed to call witnesses to the stand or present any evidence that would cast doubt over the prosecution's case. The most significant piece of evidence presented against Stinney was his alleged confession, but there was no written record of the teen admitting to the murders. Following a 10-minute deliberation, the all-white jury found Stinney guilty of first-degree murder. That same day, the judge sentenced the teen to death by electric chair. George was executed at the Central Correctional Institutions in Columbia, South Carolina on the 16th of June, 1944 at 7:30 p.m. At 7:25 p.m, standing at just 5 feet and 1 inch tall and weighing just over 90 pounds, 3 police officers approached the cell where George was being held. One officer entered and took him out of the cell. The officers escorted him to the execution room, where they placed him in the electric chair using a thick book, either a telephone directory or a Bible, as a booster seat because he was so small. George was then restrained by his arms, legs and body to the chair. His father was allowed to approach George to say his final words to his son. An officer asked George if he had any last words to say, but he just shook his head. George could only whimper and take deep breaths as one of the officers pulled a strap from the chair and placed it over his mouth, causing him to break into tears. Then they placed a face mask over his face, which did not fit him, as George continued sobbing. When the lethal electricity was applied, the mask covering George's face slipped off, revealing George's burned scalp and tears streaming down his face, saliva dripping from his mouth. George's teeth were smoking and he had one eye missing and was declared dead after 8 minutes. The next day, he was buried by his family at Sumter, South Carolina. His body was in an unmarked grave in the hopes the anonymity will allow him to rest in peace forever. 70 years later, George's first-degree murder conviction was appealed in 2014. His siblings claimed that his confession was coerced and that he had an alibi. He was with his sister Amy at the time of the murders. They also noted that a man named Wilfred Johnny Hunter, who claimed to be Stinney's cellmate at the Sumter County Jail, said that Stinney denied murdering Binnicker and Thames. After a year of consideration, on the 17th of December 2014, Judge Carmen T. Mullen overturned Stinney's first-degree murder conviction, stating that his sentencing was cruel and unusual. She wrote that there was a violation of the defendant's procedural due process rights that tainted his prosecution. George Stinney Jr.'s siblings were overjoyed to learn that their brother was exonerated after 70 years, appreciating the fact that they were able to live long enough to see it happen.